The Academy Hall was too quiet for a place that held 12 different alien species under one roof. Bright banners floated in the air, showing symbols of peace and unity, but no one truly believed in peace. Not here, not in the Orion diplomatic station where power decided everything. And humans had very little of it. They were new, fragile, and constantly watched. Ethan stood near the back of the chamber, trying not to draw attention. He had trained for months to behave perfectly, to speak carefully, to never offend anyone, especially not her. She stood at the center of the room, surrounded by her own kind, tall, graceful, with silver blue skin that reflected the light like polished metal, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She was known across the station as Commander Lyra of the Virex Dominion, the strongest military species in this sector. Her people did not joke, they did not laugh, and they never smiled. Smiling in their culture meant dominance or challenge, and sometimes it meant death. Ethan knew this. Every human knew this. It was written in every rulebook they were forced to memorize. Do not stare, do not speak unless spoken to, do not show teeth. But humans had a strange weakness. They reacted before they thought, and that was exactly what happened. Lyra had just finished speaking about Alliance protocols, her voice calm and cold. And for a brief second, when the lights shifted across her face, Ethan noticed something different. The edge of her lips moved slightly, not a smile, not fully, but something softer, something almost human. And without thinking, without calculating the risk, without remembering the warnings, he stepped forward and said the words that would freeze the entire hall. "You have a nice smile." The silence that followed was not normal silence. It was heavy, thick, suffocating. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Translators flickered and went still. Even the floating security drones paused in the air, as if confused. Ethan realized too late what he had done. His heart began to pound so loudly he thought others could hear it. Several alien delegates slowly stepped away from him, creating distance, as if an explosion was about to happen. One of the Virex guards turned sharply toward him, hand moving toward a weapon that hummed with dark energy. No one spoke. No one dared to move, because everyone knew the stories. A merchant once made a joke about Virex eyes glowing in the dark. He disappeared the next day. A pilot accidentally laughed during a Virex anthem. His ship was denied clearance forever, and now a human had commented on the commander's face. Lyra did not blink. She did not breathe. She simply froze. Her silver blue eyes locked onto Ethan, scanning him, measuring him, calculating something no one else could understand. Seconds passed like hours. Ethan felt heat rising in his face. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to say it was just something humans say, but his voice refused to work. The guards waited for her signal. One small gesture and the human would be removed, quietly, permanently. This was how power worked in the galaxy, and humans were at the bottom of that ladder. The Central Council leader slowly stood, clearly preparing to smooth over the situation. But before he could speak, Lyra moved, and the entire chamber tensed. Her hand lifted slightly, and the guards stopped instantly, obeying her silent command. She stepped forward toward Ethan, each step echoing across the polished floor. And now the fear was not just his, it belonged to everyone in the hall. Because no one had ever seen her walk toward someone like this without authority behind it. She stopped directly in front of him, taller, stronger, her presence almost overwhelming. Ethan forced himself to look up, even though every instinct told him to lower his eyes. Her gaze searched his face carefully, as if she was looking for deception, for mockery, for hidden insult. But what she saw instead was something simple and honest, nervousness, embarrassment, and a strange kind of human sincerity, something rare in political chambers like this. Her head tilted slightly, a small movement that shocked her own guards. And then something even more shocking happened. The edge of her lips curved upward again, this time clearly, slowly, wider than before. Gasps filled the hall. A Virex smiling was unheard of. It was not weakness. It was not dominance. It was something else entirely, and no one understood what it meant. Ethan blinked, unsure if he was about to survive or become a diplomatic disaster recorded in history books. Lyra's voice, softer now but still powerful, broke the silence. "Explain," she said, not as a threat, but as a request. And in that moment, something changed in the room. The fear shifted into curiosity, the tension into confusion, because the most dangerous commander in the quadrant was not angry. She was interested in a fragile human who dared to speak without fear, or maybe with fear, but spoke anyway. Ethan swallowed and prepared to answer, knowing that whatever he said next could shape not just his fate, but humanity's place in the galaxy. If you enjoy stories like this and want to see what happens next in this galactic tension, consider subscribing to this channel to support more HFY Sci-Fi adventures. Because this was only the beginning, and no one in that chamber yet understood why a simple human compliment had just shifted the balance of power in ways they could not predict. The chamber did not return to normal after that moment. It could not, because something impossible had just happened. Commander Lyra of the Virex Dominion had smiled. Not as a threat, not as a signal of conquest, but as a reaction to a human compliment. And across the diplomatic station, whispers began to spread like silent fire. The alien who never smiled had done the unthinkable. Ethan stood in front of her, still unsure whether he had just saved his species from humiliation or pushed them toward extinction. Lyra's silver-blue eyes remained fixed on him, studying him the way a scientist studies a rare and unstable element. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried through the hall with calm authority. "Walk with me," she said, and that simple command created a new wave of tension because no one refused a Virex commander, especially not one who commanded fleets capable of erasing planets. The guards stepped aside instantly, their dark armor reflecting the chamber lights, and the delegates parted like water around them as Lyra began walking toward the private corridor that led to restricted chambers. Ethan hesitated only half a second before following, aware that thousands of eyes were now watching him, some filled with fear, others with anger, because humans were not supposed to attract this kind of attention. They were supposed to stay quiet and grateful, but now the human who broke protocol was being escorted personally by the most feared being in the quadrant, and no one understood why. Inside the corridor, the air felt colder, quieter, insulated from the political noise of the main hall. The walls shimmered with Virex technology, alive with faint pulses of blue light, and for several long steps neither of them spoke. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to remember every cultural lesson he had studied. Virex did not express casual emotion. Their society evolved under brutal conditions on a high-gravity world where weakness meant extinction. Emotional control became survival. Smiles were historically recorded only in ancient war rituals, displayed before combat as a sign of total confidence. So why had she smiled now? And more importantly, why had she asked him to explain instead of ordering his removal? They reached a sealed chamber, and the door slid open without a sound, revealing a private observation room overlooking the stars. Massive windows displayed the dark stretch of space dotted with distant suns. Lyra stepped inside, and the door closed behind them, isolating them completely. Ethan felt the weight of the moment press against him. This was not just a conversation. This was an evaluation, and perhaps a test. Lyra moved closer to the window and stared at the stars for a few seconds. Before speaking, her voice lower now, less formal. "No one has ever said that to me," she admitted, and those words alone would have shaken the entire council if they had heard them, because vulnerability was not a Virex trait. Ethan blinked, surprised by the honesty in her tone. "On Earth, it's normal," he said carefully, choosing simple words. "When we think someone looks happy, we say something kind." He paused, unsure if he was making things worse. It was not a challenge, not dominance, just kindness. The last word felt fragile in the air between them, as if it might break under the weight of Virex culture. Lyra turned slowly to face him again, her expression unreadable, but not hostile. "Kindness," she repeated as if testing the meaning of the word. In Virex history, kindness was considered inefficient, unnecessary in survival calculations. Yet the way Ethan had spoken carried no hidden agenda, no fear-based manipulation, only simple honesty, and that confused her more than any insult would have. She had studied humans before, their wars, their resilience, their strange ability to rebuild after disasters that would have ended most species, But this small act unsettled her more than any human military report because it did not fit into strategic logic. Outside the chamber, rumors grew stronger. Alien delegates contacted their governments, asking whether this was a diplomatic maneuver. Some believe humans had discovered a psychological weakness in the Virex commander. Others feared a secret alliance forming behind closed doors. Tension began rising across the station. Security levels quietly increased. And deep within the council archives, old Virex cultural records were accessed for the first time in centuries, searching for any precedent of such behavior. But there was none. Lyra had never smiled during negotiations, never during war briefings, never even during personal victories. She was known as the unmoving blade, precise and emotionally distant. Back in the chamber, Lyra stepped closer to Ethan, studying him not as a threat, but as a puzzle. If your kind shows teeth as kindness, she said slowly, then your species hides strength behind softness. And there was no insult in her tone, only curiosity. She had seen humans fight pirates in outer sectors with reckless courage. She had seen them rebuild colonies after radiation storms. And now she saw a human brave enough to speak casually in a room full of predators. Perhaps humans were not weak. Perhaps they were simply different. Ethan felt the intensity of her gaze, but did not look away. Not out of defiance, but out of simple human stubbornness. We smile even when we're afraid, he admitted quietly. Sometimes it helps us survive. That statement lingered in the air, because survival was a language the Virex understood perfectly. And for the first time, Lyra considered that maybe humans had survived not because of brute strength, but because of something far more dangerous, emotional unpredictability. She turned back toward the stars, her reflection faint in the glass. And again that small curve touched her lips, softer this time, more natural, as if the expression was no longer foreign. Your words disrupted 1,000 years of discipline, she said calmly. Do you understand the risk you created? And Ethan swallowed, aware that whatever answer he gave now could define the fragile bridge forming between their species. While beyond the sealed walls of that chamber, the galaxy waited, watching closely because the alien who never smiled had begun to question her own nature, and that was far more dangerous than anger ever could be. The silence inside the observation chamber felt heavier than before, not hostile, but charged with something neither of them fully understood. Lyra stood with her back to the stars while Ethan faced her, realizing that his simple human instinct had triggered something far bigger than embarrassment. It was not just a compliment anymore. It was a cultural misfire with consequences spreading beyond those walls. And the first sign of that came when the station lights outside flickered briefly, a subtle signal that higher security protocols were being activated across diplomatic sectors. Some on the council believed this was not accidental. They believed the human had done something intentional. Lyra finally turned from the window, her silver blue eyes sharper now, focused not on emotion but on analysis. In Virex society, she began slowly. A smile shown outside of ritual combat is interpreted as either mockery or a declaration of dominance. She stepped closer, not threatening but precise. If one of my officers had said what you said, it would have resulted in a duel. The word duel did not need explanation. Ethan understood immediately that such a challenge would not end with apologies. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay steady, because backing away now would confirm weakness, and humans have been labeled weak enough already. It was neither, Ethan said carefully, choosing the simplest words he could. On Earth, we smile when we are happy, when we are nervous, even when we meet someone new. He hesitated before adding, we use smiles to lower tension, not raise it. He watched her expression closely, tried to read any sign of anger, but instead he saw calculation, her mind adjusting old rules against new data, which was far more unsettling than rage. Lyra circled him slowly, not like a predator hunting prey, but like a commander studying battlefield terrain. Your species reveals emotion freely, she observed. You expose weakness openly. And Ethan shook his head slightly. It looks like weakness, but it is not, he replied, his voice gaining confidence despite the situation. When we show emotion, we build trust. When we build trust, we survive together. He paused, thinking of Earth's long and painful history, wars that nearly destroyed them, disasters that force cooperation. Humans survive because we connect, not because we dominate. The idea hung between them like a fragile bridge, because the Virex built their empire through dominance and strength. Connection was considered inefficient, even dangerous. Yet Lyra had seen human colonies operate in ways that defied pure logic. Small groups surviving impossible odds because they protected each other with fierce loyalty, something no Virex algorithm had fully explained. Beyond the chamber, tension was rising rapidly. Several delegates had already submitted formal protests claiming the human had attempted psychological manipulation of a Virex commander. Rumors spread that Earth's diplomats were using emotional tactics to destabilize stronger species. Security officers reviewed footage repeatedly, searching for hidden signals or coded gestures. And within Virex command ships orbiting the station, reports were being filed directly to the Dominion High Corps, a governing body that did not tolerate irregular behavior from its commanders, especially not emotional irregularity. Inside, Lyra stopped pacing and faced Ethan directly. "You disrupted more than etiquette," she said, her tone still calm but edged with gravity. "You forced me to experience an expression outside its intended purpose." She touched her own lips lightly as if unfamiliar with emotion. "When you spoke, I felt no insult, no dominance challenge, only warmth." The final words sounded almost foreign in her mouth, and that frightened her more than any threat could have, because warmth was not a controlled variable in Virex doctrine. Ethan noticed the subtle change in her posture, less rigid, less armored by discipline, and he understood that this was not just about cultural difference, it was about identity. If a Virex commander could smile for reasons outside combat ritual, then centuries of emotional suppression might not be absolute truth, and that realization could fracture her authority. "I did not mean to cause trouble," he admitted quietly. "I just reacted the way humans do." Lyra studied him for a long moment, and something in her eyes shifted from analysis to introspection. "That is precisely the problem," she said softly. "Your species reacts." And in that simple statement lay the heart of the misfire. Humans did not filter every word through hierarchy and survival calculus. They spoke from impulse, from emotion, from instinct. And that unpredictability could either destabilize galactic order or strengthen it in ways no one anticipated. Suddenly, a low chime echoed through the chamber, signaling an incoming secure transmission. Lyra did not break eye contact as she activated it with a subtle hand gesture. A holographic symbol of the Virex Dominion appeared briefly, pulsing red, a direct inquiry from High Corps Command. They were already aware, already questioning her deviation from protocol. The timing made one thing clear. This incident was no longer private. The hologram faded after transmitting a silent code that only she could interpret, but Ethan saw enough to understand the situation was escalating. "They are watching," she said quietly, confirming his fear. "They believe you may be testing my authority." And now the stakes became clearer than ever. What started as a compliment could evolve into interstellar suspicion. If the Dominion concluded that a human had influenced her behavior, it would justify restrictions on Earth's diplomatic access. Maybe even sanctions or worse. Ethan felt the weight of that possibility, but instead of panic he felt a strange resolve. "Then tell them the truth," he said. "Tell them a human saw something good and said it out loud." It sounded simple, almost foolish against the complexity of galactic politics. Yet that simplicity was precisely what unsettled Lyra, because truth delivered without calculation was rare, especially in halls built on strategy. She moved toward the window again, staring at the vast darkness beyond, where fleets and alliances balanced on fragile agreements. And she realized something that unsettled her more deeply than any political consequence. The warmth she felt when he spoke had not disappeared. It lingered, subtle but persistent. And for the first time in her disciplined life, she questioned whether her species had mistaken emotional suppression for strength. Outside the chamber, the station buzzed with tension, unaware that inside, the true shift was not political but personal. Because the cultural misfire had not created anger. It had created curiosity, and curiosity in a Virex commander was far more unpredictable than rage. And as Lyra turned back toward Ethan once more, her voice quieter but resolute, she made a decision that would ripple far beyond this room. "You will remain under my observation," she said, not as a threat, but as a declaration. And somewhere deep in the vast structure of galactic power, invisible lines had begun to move, quietly, dangerously, and no one yet understood how far those ripples would travel. From that moment forward, Commander Lyra did something no Virex commander had done in recorded history. She began studying a single human not as a threat assessment, not as a military variable, but as a question that refused to leave her mind. And across the Orion diplomatic station, the news spread carefully, quietly, that the unmoving Blade had taken personal interest in the species once labeled minor. Humans were strange. That much every archive agreed on, but now strange no longer meant weak. It meant unpredictable, and unpredictability in a galaxy built on rigid power structures was dangerous. Lyra requested access to human behavioral archives under the excuse of strategic evaluation. The Council granted it without hesitation because they believed she was searching for weaknesses, but what she found unsettled her far more than a battlefield report ever could. Humans survived an extinction-level asteroid and turned it into a scientific achievement. They nearly destroyed themselves in world wars and then built global alliances stronger than before. They split the atom, and instead of ending their story, they stepped into space. Every disaster in their history did not erase them. It refined them, and woven through every conflict and catastrophe was something she could not quantify. Emotion used as fuel, fear transformed into courage, grief turned into unity. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his assigned duties under her direct supervision, which caused visible discomfort among other species. He attended briefings, translated minor human protocols, and answered questions she asked with unsettling directness. He did not treat her like a distant war figure. He spoke to her the way humans speak to each other, respectfully, but without worship. And this alone confused her guards, who were trained to maintain strict emotional distance. One afternoon, during a tactical simulation exercise, she observed something that forced her to pause the entire scenario. A simulated pirate fleet ambushed a mixed-species convoy. Standard protocol predicted heavy losses until reinforcements arrived. Virex doctrine favored calculated retreat and regrouping, but Ethan suggested something different: distract them. He said simply, "Make them chase something they think is weak." The room reacted with skepticism, but he explained further. Humans had survived predators on Earth not by overpowering them, but by confusing them, setting traps, using creativity instead of brute strength. The simulation was reset, and his strategy implemented experimentally. The pirate fleet fractured formation, chasing false signals and decoy ships, buying time for reinforcements to strike from unexpected angles. The room fell silent when the results displayed a 67% increase in survival rate. Lyra did not smile openly this time, but her eyes shifted with recognition. Humans did not simply endure, they adapted quickly, and they were comfortable operating inside chaos where other species demanded order. This realization unsettled several senior delegates, who quietly began filing reports suggesting that humanity's unpredictability posed a strategic instability risk. Fear of what cannot be predicted spreads faster than fear of strength, and now whispers moved through council corridors that perhaps Earth should be limited before it grew too influential. Yet Lyra continued her observation, not blindly supportive but intensely analytical. She requested footage from human disaster relief operations on distant colonies. She watched as unarmed human engineers ran into unstable environments to rescue alien civilians. She observed human medics treating species that once insulted them publicly. She studied how humans laughed during crisis briefings, not out of disrespect, but as a pressure release, a method of keeping fear from taking control. And slowly, quietly, something inside her long-disciplined worldview began to shift. One evening, she summoned Ethan to the observation deck again, stars stretching endlessly beyond the glass. "Your species should not have survived its early centuries," she said calmly. "Your wars were inefficient, Your political division's unstable. Ethan nodded without defensiveness. We know, he replied. We almost ended ourselves many times. She tilted her head slightly. Then why are you still here? And this question was not sarcastic. It was genuine. Ethan took a slow breath before answering. Because we care, he said simply. Even when we fight, even when we fail, we care about something, about someone, that makes us stand back up. The simplicity of the answer disturbed her logic systems. Care was inefficient, but efficiency had not saved species lost to extinction events across the galaxy. Perhaps there was strength hidden inside what the Virex dismissed as emotional excess. Unbeknownst to them, Virex High Core Command had begun deeper review of her behavior. Statistical anomalies flagged her reduced aggression markers and increased cross-species engagement. Some within the Dominion saw this as growth. Others as contamination, and political tension tightened invisibly like a wire pulled too far. If she appeared compromised by human influence, her command could be reassigned, and a more rigid successor would not hesitate to isolate Earth diplomatically. Lyra sensed this pressure without being told. She felt the scrutiny in encrypted messages and subtle shifts in fleet command patterns, yet she did not withdraw her observation. Instead, she leaned into it further, testing Ethan with sharper questions, challenging human history with harsh critique, but he responded not with anger, only with honest acknowledgement of flaws and quiet pride in survival. And for the first time, she recognized something profoundly dangerous about humanity. They did not hide their weaknesses, they transformed them. As days passed, she noticed another unsettling detail. Whenever tension rose in meetings, Ethan's presence seemed to lower it. His small jokes, his relaxed posture, his steady eye contact subtly influenced room dynamics. Species that distrusted each other responded more calmly when human mediated. It was not dominance, it was balance. And balance in a fragile galactic alliance was more powerful than fleets. Standing again before the stars, Lyra allowed herself a private realization she would never speak aloud. Humans were strange, yes, but strange in the way gravity is strange to those who have never fallen. Subtle yet unstoppable, soft yet shaping entire worlds over time. And if the Dominion failed to understand that soon, they might mistake gentleness for weakness at the worst possible moment. Behind her composed expression, calculations continued. Not about conquest, not about defense, but about possibility. Because if a species that fragile could survive so much and still smile, then perhaps strength was not defined by silence and control alone. Perhaps strength also meant daring to show emotion in a galaxy that feared it. And as distant stars flickered beyond the station glass, Lyra realized the most dangerous truth of all. Humanity was not rising loudly. It was rising quietly. And quiet change is the hardest to stop once it begins. The first sign of a new threat did not come with explosions or dramatic warnings. It arrived as silence. A mining colony on the outer edge of Virex-controlled space stopped transmitting mid-cycle. No distress signal, no debris field, just absence. At first it was dismissed as technical failure, but then a second outpost vanished, then a third, each one located further beyond the mapped trade lanes. As if something was testing the border carefully, probing without revealing itself. And within days, the Orion diplomatic station shifted from cautious politics to quiet emergency preparation. Lyra received the encrypted reports before most delegates even knew there was a problem. Long-range scans showed gravitational distortions where colonies once stood, not destruction in the traditional sense, but compression, matter folded inward unnaturally. Ships sent to investigate returned with corrupted data logs and crews reporting severe psychological stress. Some spoke of shadows moving against starlight. Others described hearing signals inside their own communication systems that were not part of known language structures. And then one scout ship failed to return entirely. The council convened urgently. Species that normally argued over trade tariffs now sat in rare agreement that something was deeply wrong. Holographic projections displayed the affected sectors, red markers spreading slowly like infection points across a star map. And for the first time in many cycles, the Virex did not project absolute certainty. Lyra stood before the chamber, posture steady, voice controlled. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension she did not hide completely. This pattern does not match piracy, rebellion, or natural anomaly, she stated. It is deliberate. Whispers moved through the chamber. Ancient records were accessed, forbidden archives unlocked, and what surfaced chilled even the most battle-hardened species. There were fragments of data from thousands of years ago describing a civilization erased by something referred to only as the null tide, an entity or force that did not conquer territory. It consumed it, not with fire or bombardment, but with gravitational distortion and signal corruption, leaving nothing stable behind. The Virex had once fought something similar in early expansion history, but records were incomplete, heavily redacted, as if the Dominion had chosen to forget certain details. Ethan listened from the human delegation section, his earlier diplomatic misstep, now forgotten in the shadow of extinction-level threat. And while many species reacted with predictable strategies of fleet mobilization and defensive perimeter expansion, he noticed something missing. No one was asking how this enemy thought, only how to stop it. And that distinction mattered, because humans had survived not by overpowering stronger enemies, but by understanding them. Lyra requested permission to deploy Virex strike fleets to the outer sectors. Authorization was granted instantly. But as the chamber prepared for war readiness, another transmission cut through the Council's internal networks, distorted, fragmented, but undeniably artificial. It was not a distress signal, not a threat, but a pattern, repeating pulses that shifted frequencies unpredictably. Each attempt to decode, it caused system instability, as if a signal adapted to analysis itself. Panic rippled across technological departments. This was not conventional warfare. In private strategy session, Lyra summoned Ethan once more, not out of curiosity now, but necessity. The observation deck felt different this time, heavy with urgency rather than philosophical tension. Your species excels in asymmetrical response, she said without preamble. You fight enemies stronger than yourselves by altering the battlefield. Her eyes held no pride, only calculation. What would humans do against something that erases entire colonies without warning? Ethan studied the star map projected between them, red sectors blinking slowly, and felt the familiar human instincts stirring. Fear, yes, but also determination. First, we would stop reacting emotionally, he said, carefully aware of the irony in speaking about emotional control to a Virex commander. We would assume the enemy wants us afraid, wants us predictable. He traced a finger along the spread pattern. It is testing response times, measuring fleet movement, mapping defensive priorities. Lyra's gaze sharpened because this aligned disturbingly well with early fleet logs. Virex strike groups had arrived precisely where the distortions had already ceased, always one step behind, always reacting rather than anticipating. Then we changed the pattern, Ethan continued. We send false fleets, broadcast fake distress signals, make it think we are scattered and disorganized. He looked up at her steadily. Humans survive predators by pretending to be weaker than we were, until the moment we weren't. Outside the station, the first Virex warships engaged a distortion zone directly, and what returned was a single fragmented message before signal collapse, describing space folding inward like fabric pulled tight, weapon systems firing into nothingness, and then silence. Entire crews lost without visible impact. The council chamber fell in a stunned stillness as casualty numbers updated. This was no pirate force, no rival empire. This was something older, patient, and uninterested in. Negotiation. Political blame began surfacing instantly. Some delegates accused the Virex of awakening an ancient threat through territorial expansion. Others subtly implied that humanity's unpredictable behavior had destabilized delicate alliances, fierce searches for targets, and humans were still the newest variable in the equation. But Lyra did not engage in accusation. Her focus remained fixed on adaptation, on breaking the enemy's pattern before it fully understood theirs. Deep within Dominion Command, High Corps analysts monitored her decisions closely, noting that she had incorporated human strategic input into fleet movement algorithms, and that fact alone unsettled hardline traditionalists. If a Virex commander relied too heavily on human unpredictability, it could signal ideological contamination. Yet results mattered more than pride. And early signs suggested that false fleet deployments were disrupting the null tide's advance slightly. Distortions hesitated, as if recalculating. Back in the observation deck, tension pressed between Lyra and Ethan like static electricity. If this entity adapts, she said quietly, then it will eventually account for deception. Ethan nodded. Then we adapt faster, he replied simply, and she studied him again, recognizing the core difference between their species. Virex sought control. Humans embraced change. And in a battle against something that thrived on predictability, change might be the only true weapon. Alarms sounded across the station suddenly. A new distortion signature had appeared far closer than expected, not at the border, but within Allied trade lanes. The threat was accelerating. Testing inner defenses now, and through the wide observation window, they could see distant fleet formations igniting engines in urgent response, stars briefly hidden by the glow of mobilized warships. Lyra's expression hardened into command mode. But beneath that discipline, something else moved. Not fear, not doubt, but recognition. The galaxy stood at the edge of something far larger than political rivalry, and survival might depend not on who was strongest, but on who adapted first. She turned toward Ethan one final time before issuing fleet directives, her voice steady but edged with quiet intensity. Your species smiles in the face of danger, she said, recalling his earlier words. It is time to prove that was not weakness. And as distant space bent again under invisible force, humanity's strange resilience prepared to face something that did not understand emotion at all, and that difference might soon decide the fate of them all. When the null tide pushed into the inner trade lanes, it expected panic. It expected fleets to rush in tight formations the way disciplined empires always did. It expected fear to create predictable defense patterns. But what it encountered instead was chaos that looked almost accidental. Human ships moved in uneven clusters, broadcasting conflicting signals, some retreating too quickly, others advancing without clear logic, and to traditional Virex commanders the strategy felt dangerously unstructured. Yet Lyra allowed it, because she had seen what humans could do inside disorder. The first coordinated countermeasure began quietly. Human engineers modified communication arrays to emit layered false data. Distress calls overlapped with civilian chatter. Outdated coordinates mixed with real-time fleet movements, creating a digital storm that blurred strategic clarity. When the null tide distortion field expanded toward what appeared to be a vulnerable supply convoy, it collided not with fear, but with a trap. Concealed Virex strike cruisers emerged from gravitational blind spots while human frigates detonated controlled energy bursts that disrupted spatial compression patterns. The distortion faltered, not destroyed, but confused. Its advance slowed for the first time since its reappearance. Inside the command bridge of her flagship, Lyra observed the battle unfold, not with emotional display, but with intense focus, and beside her stood Ethan wearing a simple tactical interface band, feeding rapid adaptation models into the fleet network. Human analysts worked alongside Virex strategists, something once politically unthinkable, now necessary for survival. Every time the null tide adjusted, humans adjusted faster, rerouting ships unpredictably, sacrificing minor positions to lure distortions into zones seeded with experimental resonance mines designed by Earth scientists who had once studied black hole behavior for curiosity rather than war. The null tide reacted with increased aggression. Entire sectors flickered as gravitational waves rippled outward, and one human cruiser was caught at the edge of compression, its hull bending under impossible pressure. Alarms screamed across every Allied frequency, but instead of retreating in fear, the damaged ship transmitted a manual override signal that triggered a chain reaction through nearby drones, amplifying resonance pulses that forced the distortion field to recoil. The cruiser was lost, but the data it transmitted during its final seconds provided critical insight into the enemy structure, and within minutes human programmers had updated predictive models across the fleet. Lyra felt something shift inside her, as she watched the sacrifice. Not despair, but fierce respect. Humans did not crumble under loss. They transformed it into strategy, and that resilience unsettled even the most hardened Virex officers. Because the Dominion valued strength through survival probability, while humans seemed willing to risk everything for collective gain, and that willingness disrupted the enemy's calculations. On a nearby battlefield corridor, Lyra herself engaged directly, leading a spearhead formation into a narrowing distortion zone, while human pilots executed unpredictable flanking maneuvers around her. The stars warped, bending like liquid metal. And for a moment, even Virex battle algorithms struggled to maintain stability. But then something unexpected happened. Human fighters began transmitting laughter across encrypted channels. Not mockery, not hysteria, but controlled humor designed to stabilize their own fear responses, and that signal pattern interfered with the Null Tide's adaptive frequency scanning, introducing irregular emotional noise into its detection systems. Ethan's voice cut through the command channel calmly. It analyzes patterns, so give it none, and immediately the fleet shifted again. Ships broke formation deliberately, some accelerating toward distortion edges at odd angles, others shutting down engines entirely to drift silently before reigniting at calculated intervals. It looked reckless, even foolish, but the Null Tide hesitated, its compression waves fragmenting as if recalculating a problem that refused stable variables. In that hesitation, Lyra seized initiative. Her flagship unleashed concentrated graviton lances into the distortion core, while human frigates detonated resonance mines precisely where predictive algorithms indicated structural weakness. Space itself trembled as the distortion folded inward violently, not consuming, but collapsing against its own unstable geometry, and for the first time since its return, the Null Tide retreated, not destroyed, but wounded. Its advance halted. Across Allied channels, disbelief turned into cautious hope. Sectors once marked red stabilized slowly. And though losses were heavy, the unstoppable force had been forced backward, not by superior firepower alone, but by adaptive unpredictability, by emotion turned into tactical advantage, by species once dismissed as fragile, proving that survival is not always about dominance. On the command bridge, as reports confirmed the retreat, Lyra felt a rare and unmistakable expression return to her face, her lips curved upward. Not ritual, not calculated, but genuine, and several Virex officers froze in quiet shock, because their commander, mid-battle, had smiled again, but this time no one mistook it for weakness. It was recognition that humanity's strange blend of courage, creativity, and connection had shifted the balance of a war that logic alone could not win. Ethan looked at the battle map where distortions receded like a tide pulled back by unseen force. Exhaustion clear in his eyes, but resolve unbroken. It will adapt again, he said quietly, aware that victory was temporary, and Lyra nodded. Then so will we, she replied, her voice carrying not just command, but partnership, something the Dominion had never fully embraced before. Far beyond the immediate battlefield, hidden fragments of the Null Tide pulsed faintly in deep space, recalibrating, learning, and preparing to return stronger. But now it faced an enemy unlike any it had encountered in recorded cycles, a species that did not fear chaos, that smiled under pressure, that turned sacrifice into evolution. And as fleets regrouped under the light of distant stars, one truth became clear across the Alliance. Humanity was no longer the weakest presence in the galaxy. It was the variable that could not be solved, and in a war against something that thrived on prediction, that made all the difference. The retreat of the Null Tide did not bring celebration. It brought silence, the kind of silence that follows survival when everyone understands how close extinction truly was. Fleets drifted in damaged formations across stabilized sectors. Rescue ships moved carefully through debris fields where entire crews had made their final stand. And on the Orion diplomatic station, the council gathered not to argue, but to reassess everything they believed about strength, because the unstoppable force had been stopped, not crushed, but pushed back by a strategy born from unpredictability and emotional resilience. And at the center of that shift stood two figures who had once shared a single awkward moment in a diplomatic hall. Lyra stood before the council chamber once more. But the atmosphere was different now. There was no tension directed at her curiosity, no whispered doubt about contamination. Instead, there was measured respect. The Virex High Core transmitted live observation, analyzing every movement, every inflection in her voice. And for the first time in centuries, the Dominion addressed a non-Virex species not as subordinate ally, but as strategic equal. She presented battle data calmly, outlining how human adaptive modeling disrupted null tide compression logic, how emotional variability introduced noise into an enemy dependent on pattern recognition, how sacrifice and creativity combined into something no rigid doctrine could predict. Some delegates struggled visibly with this truth, because it meant admitting that the weakest military force in the alliance had become its most critical variable. But evidence silenced pride. The survival rates were undeniable. Sectors once marked lost were stable again, and human Virex cooperative command structures were now embedded into fleet operations permanently. The galaxy had shifted quietly, irreversibly. Ethan sat among the human delegation, no longer ignored, no longer tolerated as minor presence, but watched with curiosity. And when Lyra concluded her report, she did something no one anticipated. She stepped down from the central platform and walked directly toward him in full view of every species present. The chamber fell into attentive stillness, because symbolism mattered in galactic politics, and gestures carried weight beyond words. She stopped before him, silver blue eyes steady, and for a brief second the memory of that first reckless compliment flickered between them. "Your species altered the course of this war," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the chamber without amplification, not through dominance, but through adaptation. There was no hesitation now, no guarded uncertainty, only acknowledgement. And then, slowly, deliberately, she smiled, not as ritual, not as dominance display, but as open expression, wider than ever before. Gasps did not follow this time. Instead, a ripple of understanding moved through the delegates, because they now recognized that the expression was not weakness. It was declaration, a declaration that strength could include warmth, that control could coexist with connection, and that survival in a galaxy of unknown threats required more than rigid discipline. It required evolution. Far beyond the council walls, fragments of the null tide lingered in dark sectors, recalibrating, preparing to return with refined strategy. But something fundamental had changed in its opposition. Humanity was no longer dismissed as fragile. It was studied, integrated, and respected, and perhaps more importantly, its influence was spreading quietly into cultures that once rejected emotional expression entirely. Virex training simulations began incorporating adaptive irregularity models. Younger officers questioned old suppression doctrines, and subtle social shifts unfolded within Dominion ranks. Later, on the observation deck overlooking endless stars, Lyra and Ethan stood once more where it had all begun. The vast darkness no longer felt empty, but alive with possibility and danger. "The null tide will return," she said calmly, not as warning, but as certainty, and Ethan nodded. "Then we'll be ready," he replied, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. She turned slightly toward him, studying the human expression she had once misinterpreted as challenge, and now understood as something far more complex. "When you spoke in the chamber that day," she said thoughtfully, "I believed you had disrupted order." She paused briefly. "But perhaps you restored balance." Ethan smiled gently, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just human. "Sometimes small things change big systems," he said, and the simplicity of that statement carried more truth than any battle statistic, because the shift had not begun with fleets or weapons. It began with an unfiltered moment of kindness. Across the galaxy, alliances strengthened cautiously, strategies evolved, and watchful eyes scanned distant space for the next distortion wave. But beneath all the preparation lay a new understanding. Survival was not owned by the strongest species. It belonged to those willing to adapt, to feel, to connect, even under threat. And as distant stars flickered beyond the station glass, Lyra allowed herself one final quiet reflection: that the most dangerous force in the galaxy was not the null tide, not gravitational collapse, not ancient enemies hidden in darkness, but a simple human act that defied rigid logic, a smile offered without calculation and returned without fear. And somewhere in the vastness beyond, as the universe shifted slowly toward its next conflict, the meaning of that smile continued to echo, subtle yet unstoppable, shaping a future neither of them had fully imagined.